In the majority of cases today, people who migrate choose to do so voluntarily. They also do not face serious risks if they choose to return to their place of origin. In this video, however, we are going to focus on people who are forced to migrate across international borders. Within this group, we'll focus on asylum seekers and refugees. These terms are often misunderstood, mixed up, and misused. In this video, we will clarify the differences and similarities with regard to the meaning of these terms. We've discussed in previous videos how terminology is critical to understanding in the migration field. Lawmakers, journalists, and organizations need to be clear about who their statements and measures apply to. This is especially true for asylum seekers and refugees because their protection is a priority under international human rights law. Furthermore, understanding the groups these terms describe helps decrease the stigma surrounding them. Let's first talk about the term refugee, since this is a globally recognized legal status. The term is codified in international law within the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 Protocol, or revision. The document was written in the aftermath of the Second World War and the onset of the Cold War, meaning it's primarily targeting people affected by violence and persecution in Europe before 1951. The 1967 Protocol adjusted the definition's scope to apply to cases occurring after 1951 and outside of Europe. The refugee definition is lengthy, so let's look at it piece by piece. First, a refugee must be fearful of being persecuted. Reasons for this can range from race, religion, and nationality to even holding a particular political opinion. This fear must be well-founded, meaning that there is indeed a genuine threat of persecution. Secondly, someone must leave their country of nationality, otherwise they would be considered as an internally displaced person. For people who are not citizens of any country or stateless persons, they must still cross an international border by leaving the country that they normally live in. Finally, refugee status is granted to refugees who are not only outside of their country, but are also unwilling or unable to return to the country they were displaced from. We'll get into the process of receiving refugee status in just a moment, but let's first talk about some rights and responsibilities refugees are assigned in the Convention. One of the most critical topics for refugees is the principle of non-refoulement. According to the UN's Human Rights Office, this is a prohibition on removing or deporting a person back to a country where they are at risk of serious human rights violations. For refugees, this means that they should not be sent back to their origin countries if they would face serious risks. The Convention also lays out basic rights for refugees such as housing and job opportunities in their host country. Additionally, refugees are given responsibilities to abide by the laws and regulations of their host country and to promote public order. Now, how is this definition applied in practice? Individual states who are party to either the Convention, its protocol, or both use it when considering whether to grant refugee status to people who file asylum applications. This is where our second term, asylum seeker, comes into play. Simply put, an asylum seeker is someone seeking international protection. When someone flees their country of nationality or habitual residence and files an application for refugee status abroad, they are considered an asylum seeker until their final decision regarding their application is made. If approved, their status changes from asylum seeker to refugee. That means, while not all asylum seekers will be recognized as refugees, all refugees were originally asylum seekers. In general, this application and decision process is handled by individual states. However, the UN's refugee agency, UNHCR, is tasked with monitoring refugee determination processes and even taking an active role in countries that do not have the resources to process applications on their own. This does not mean, however, that all countries process asylum applications the same way. Remember how the refugee definition is quite lengthy? Well, it's also pretty vague, which means it's applied differently depending on the interpretation. Let's take the term persecution, for example. Does this mean the source of the persecution can be anything from government to civilian groups? Some countries say yes, but others only grant asylum when the country's government plays a role in the persecution. This perspective reflects the definition's original context, which concerned people suffering under the Nazi and Soviet regimes. This is indeed a current critique of the refugee definition. It does not explicitly address modern cases of persecution by non-state actors like extremist groups, for example. In addition to critiques of the current refugee definition, the asylum application process has its share of shortcomings. Beyond the lack of standardization between countries, it is typically a rigorous and sometimes traumatic experience for asylum seekers. The burden of proving that the fear of persecution is well-founded lies on the asylum seeker themselves. To prove that they qualify under the Refugee Convention, asylum seekers undergo one or multiple interviews where they must describe the traumatic events that force them to flee their country. Not only are these events difficult to recount, but asylum seekers' coherence and clarity may be negatively affected by their experiences. This could result in their application being rejected if the interviewers do not understand the situation or do not believe that the applicant's fear is indeed well-founded. Let's end with one final distinction that the UNHCR is very clear about. From the UN's perspective, the term refugee and migrant are not interchangeable. While some may argue that a refugee had to migrate as an asylum seeker, the UN asserts that a migrant chooses to move, whereas refugees were forced to do so. Their reasoning for this distinction is to emphasize that refugees need protection from life-threatening situations, and their protection should thus be a priority. However, many migration scholars do not agree with this differentiation and see refugees as a subcategory of migrants. So they are migrants, just a very specific type of migrant. That is the stance that this channel takes also. Do you agree with this distinction? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I hope you also subscribe and turn on the notification bell to keep up to date with the channel's weekly videos. And see you next time.